What hurts more than betrayal? Being humiliated by your own father in front of the most powerful men in America. He mocked me, reduced me to nothing, but my silent revenge was already written into my skin. Justice has a way of cutting deeper than pride. And in that chamber, his empire began to crumble. My name is Alexandra Pierce. I'm 37 years old, an Army intelligence officer assigned to the Pentagon, and I've spent most of my career living in the shadows of men who believed control was theirs by birthright. I've learned to survive in silence, to let others underestimate me, to wear their dismissal like camouflage. But the morning my father dragged me into that gleaming steel conference room, humiliation was not camouflage. It was a blade pressed against my throat in front of an audience that already wanted me to bleed. He didn't introduce me as a decorated officer. He didn't speak of the years I spent holding missions together with precision and sacrifice. He stood tall, ribbons blazing, and cut me down with one practiced line. "She's good with machines, but don't mistake her for a soldier. She's just here to take notes." Laughter followed, sharp and echoing, bouncing off the polished walls and stabbing deeper than any weapon. They didn't see the hours I'd spent in combat drills, the scars I carried, the battles I had already won. All they saw was a father defining his daughter as less. I kept my eyes forward. My hands stayed still on the table, not a twitch to betray the storm in my chest. Silence was my armor. I let them laugh because I knew what none of them did, that buried beneath my sleeve was the ink they were never supposed to see. A code etched in black, a symbol of training and survival that no one could erase. My father thought he owned the story. He thought he could write me out of the record. He didn't know the evidence was already burned into my skin, waiting for the right moment to surface. That's the thing about humiliation. To them it's entertainment, a cheap thrill at someone else's expense. To me, it was fuel. I let their smirks roll off me like rain, because I had no interest in proving myself in that room, not yet. The time for proof would come, and when it did, silence would cut sharper than their laughter. They thought they had buried me under shame. In truth, they had only sharpened my resolve. This is hidden vengeance, where every story begins with betrayal but never ends the way the betrayer planned. If you're drawn to stories where humiliation transforms into strategy, where silence becomes the weapon, where justice arrives like a storm no one saw coming, then you're in the right place. Like, subscribe, and stay with me until the end. What you're about to hear is not just a story. It's a reckoning. I remember staring at the long table, its polished surface gleaming under harsh light, catching fragments of my reflection. A woman written off as insignificant. A soldier dismissed as decoration. My father thought that reflection was reality. But reflections are only glass. They can be shattered. And when they shatter, the truth cuts everyone who tried to hold it down. They had laughed at me once. Soon they would fall silent. Because there's nothing louder than the moment when the truth surfaces and every lie collapses. That moment was coming, and it would start with a single slip of fabric, a glimpse of black ink, and the unraveling of everything he had built. He thought mocking me in public was victory. What he didn't understand was that he had just staged his own defeat. And as his laughter faded into the cold air of that room, I knew the tide was turning. They just didn't see it yet. The sleeve on my wrist was about to slip. The silence was about to break. And the entire Pentagon would discover a truth my father had spent his whole life trying to bury. I remember the way the air shifted when my sleeve slipped just enough to betray what I had spent years hiding. It wasn't dramatic, just the smallest movement. But in that still room, it felt like thunder. The ink pressed against my skin had always been mine alone, a vow burned into me the day I walked out of Fallon with my name etched into the Top Gun records. TG0911. 4 numbers, 2 letters, nothing flashy. But for those who knew, it was the kind of mark that turned silence into proof. My father's voice faltered the second he saw it. His jaw, usually locked like iron, fell open. The man who never blinked under fire froze because of a tattoo. For the first time in his life, he couldn't control the story. The others around the table followed his gaze like dominoes, eyes tracing down my wrist, widening, narrowing, calculating. Someone dropped a pen, its clatter splitting the silence, and no one moved to pick it up. Even the colonel's voice softened into something I'd never heard before, a whisper of recognition. Top Gun. 2 words, low and certain, cut through the room like a verdict. My father's shoulders stiffened, but I could see it in his eyes. He knew his grip was slipping. 12 years he had dismissed me as a technician, a glorified wrench turner, and now a single glimpse of black ink shattered the story he had built around me. I pulled my sleeve back down without hurry, buttoning it at the wrist as if nothing had happened. That tiny, deliberate act was my answer to their stares. I didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't plead. Silence carried more weight than any speech I could give. They could think what they wanted. I knew what those letters meant, and more importantly, I knew what I had done to earn them. My father might have buried my records, rewritten my career, tried to erase me from the history he worshipped, but he couldn't erase the truth carved into my skin. That was my secret, my weapon, my reminder that even if he tried to own my story, I had already written my own. When the tension broke, it wasn't with shouting, but with the sudden hum of the comm system, ground control calling for a fourth seat. The colonel's eyes flicked to me, then back to the silent room, and with a single nod, he gave permission my father could never take back. That nod was more than authorization. It was acknowledgement, a test, and an invitation into the very world I had been told I didn't belong to. My father stood there, stone still, his authority leaking into the cracks of his silence. He wanted to drag me back down, to bury me under his version of the truth, but in that moment, his voice was useless. Proof had already spoken. That's the thing about secrets. They don't just sit quietly under the skin. They wait. They build pressure. They turn into time bombs set to detonate the moment someone thinks they have you cornered. And when they explode, no amount of denial can put the pieces back together. My father had mocked me in front of the most powerful men in the building, and with one accidental slip of fabric, the story flipped. His certainty became doubt. My silence became power. And if you've ever had someone try to erase you, to define you as less, then you know what that feels like. The electric shock of watching their control dissolve. If this story stirs something in you, share it. Share it with anyone who's ever been underestimated, anyone who's ever been written off, because they'll understand the satisfaction of watching the tide turn. I didn't say a word that morning, but I didn't have to. The ink spoke for me. The silence spoke louder than my father's accusations ever could. And as the colonel's order pushed me closer to the cockpit, I felt the room shrink behind me, heavy with stares and unspoken questions. What they didn't know was that the tattoo was just the beginning, a symbol of battles fought in shadows, of truths buried under layers of politics and betrayal. And as I stepped into the light of that hangar, engines rumbling like a storm waiting to break, I knew the day wasn't about humiliation anymore. It was about exposure. His, not mine. The runway was waiting, but so was the reckoning. And the moment my hands touched the controls, the real story, one my father never wanted told, was about to ignite. Engines scream louder than judgment, and I feel every vibration through the harness biting into my collarbones. The colonel's voice is flat in my headset, steady, final, while the tower clears us for scramble. 3 Raptors surge forward in a line of fire and steel. Their afterburners tear daylight into molten ribbons. And then there is me, The fourth, the one no one expected, the one half the base is already condemning from behind glass. My father stands rigid on the tarmac, jaw clenched, posture carved into stone, as if still trying to will me back into the shadows. But the sky doesn't wait for permission. At 140 knots, I ease the nose up. Tires lift. The earth falls away. For the first time in years, the air feels like mine. I slide into formation, Shadow 4 locking tight. The lead Raptor banks left, and the horizon tilts with it. My hands move without thought. Small corrections, clean, efficient, not a single wasted motion. Training they never credited me for now speaks through muscle memory. On the radio, voices crackle. Some disbelief, some fury. Who authorized her? One spits. Another answers cold. Authorized or not, she's airborne. My father's silence weighs heavier than either. I don't need to see him to know his jaw is grinding down to dust. The mission thread cuts through the chatter. A downed pilot bleeding somewhere in hostile woods. No one cares about my resume in that valley. They only care if I can get us there on time. I tighten the formation, wings slicing the air in perfect symmetry, and hear Shadow 3's voice break across the net. Lockhart, you fly like you've been here before. I don't answer. The less I speak, the louder the silence screams. Down below, I imagine the mess hall erupting, forks clattering, rumors spinning faster than the turbines in my chest. The mechanic is flying. The disgrace just took the sky. Half the base is waiting for me to fail, because failure would justify every dismissal, every insult. But up here, there's no room for failure. Just grids, waypoints, fuel lines, and lives hanging by threads I have to sew back together. The forest beneath looks like dark surf, endless and cold. Somewhere inside it, a man is gasping through shattered ribs, waiting for rotors that won't make it unless I draw the line clean. I check my displays, mark a potential landing zone, and feed the coordinates across the net. My voice is steady, low, surgical. No hesitation, the colonel acknowledges without question, which says more than any praise ever could. Even the others fall quiet, following my calls. Each second stacks into proof. Every adjustment becomes a nail in the coffin of my father's story. He told the world I was nothing but grease under my nails, now that grease is guiding a rescue out of the fire. If this story has you holding your breath, hit the like button and subscribe to Hidden Vengeance. Every week we unravel stories like this, of betrayal, of cold strategy, of justice that cuts clean. Your support keeps these voices alive and reminds the world that silence can be the sharpest blade. The rotor wash stirs dust below, medics sprint under the blades, and a broken pilot is dragged into the light. My guidance threads them through danger inch by inch until the helicopter claws skyward again. Alive, against all odds. My calls are clipped, precise, and not one is wasted. When the colonel places me on point for egress, the truth becomes undeniable. My father may have wanted me erased, but in this moment, I am the standard the others follow. The sky doesn't clap, the radios don't cheer. But in the silence after the call, rescue secure, I feel the weight shifting, the old order cracking. And as we cut west with the rescued pilot safe on board, I know the battle on the ground hasn't even begun. Because once my boots touch the tarmac, silence will give way to questions, and questions will demand answers my father can no longer control. The summons landed on my desk before dawn, a sealed envelope pressed down like a verdict. The MP who delivered it didn't speak, just tapped the wax seal with 2 fingers, as if to remind me this wasn't an invitation. Inside, a single line carved the morning in steel. Report to the chamber at 0800. The walk across the base felt longer than any flight I had ever taken. The corridors were lined with flags and portraits, all watching, all silent. When I stepped inside the chamber, the air was too still, too sharp. A long, polished table gleamed under fluorescent light. At its head sat the colonel, posture like a drawn blade. To his right, my father. He didn't even glance at me. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, as if I was already erased. I took the lone chair opposite them, the recorder's red light blinking like a heartbeat I couldn't slow. The colonel began, measured and cold. "Yesterday's actions saved a life," he said, "but they also raised questions that cannot be ignored." Then his eyes landed on my sleeve, on the ink beneath it. TG0717. His words struck like a gavel. "Where did you acquire that designation? Who authorized it?" Silence stretched until it bent the air. I could feel it press against my chest. That was when my father leaned forward, his voice hard enough to cut. "I submitted the formal request for investigation," he said. My own father, not content with humiliation in public, was now the hand sharpening the blade against me. The colonel's tone didn't shift, but his gaze was sharper. "Your flight precision, your commands, the way you read terrain, none of this matches your record." His implication was clear. I had done the impossible, and the record showed nothing. My father pounced on it. "Admit it," he demanded, fists pressed to the table. "That tattoo ties you to something you were never meant to touch. Admit it." His voice echoed off the walls, off the steel. He wanted me cornered, broken open in front of them all. I didn't blink. "I won't deny my training," I said, "but neither will I let you twist it. That mark isn't fraud. It's survival." The colonel's expression flickered, curiosity beneath the steel. My father's jaw clenched so tight I thought the enamel might crack. "You embarrassed me," he spat. "Not you embarrassed the service, not you endangered lives. Me." The words hung heavier than accusation. I met his eyes, level, unflinching. "I saved a man in front of this base." The murmur of aides shifted like wind in dry grass. One lieutenant whispered, "She's right." Another hissed, "She's out of line." The colonel lifted a hand and the noise flattened. Enough. His gaze cut to me, then to my father, then back again. "Lockhart. Stand by for confinement to base until further notice." His voice was steady, but the fracture in the room was clear. The truth wasn't buried anymore. It was bleeding through, visible to everyone with eyes. I walked out with my spine straight, but the silence clung to me like smoke. My father's stare followed, colder than the marble floor, trying to burn something out of me. What he didn't realize was that every attempt to corner me only carved the edges sharper. He thought this inquiry was the trap. In reality, it was the opening move. And while he believed he had thrown the first strike, I already knew where his weak points lived, buried in documents, whispers, and signatures he thought no one would trace. The chamber had closed its doors, but I was already planning how to pry them back open. The hearing chamber was colder than stone, cameras blinking red at the edges, every eye waiting to see if I would fold. My father rose first, his words smooth, practiced, the cadence of a man who had spent decades molding truth into whatever shape served him. He called me reckless, unfit, desperate for attention, a mechanic pretending to be a pilot. To the audience behind us, it sounded like gospel. For a moment, the weight of his ribbons and his record bent the air in his favor. But I had been waiting for this battlefield far longer than he imagined. When they called my name, I stood without hurry, set the folders on the table, and slid the first piece of evidence across the polished wood. Radar logs. Cold numbers that confirmed every maneuver I had made the night of the rescue. No improvisation, no recklessness, pure procedure. The committee leaned forward. My father's jaw twitched. One by one, I laid out the arsenal I had built in silence. Simulator hours logged and signed by certified instructors, testimonies from pilots who had heard my commands that night, the video footage from the cockpit showing not chaos but precision. Each piece landed with a heavier thud than his accusations. The room shifted. Whispers turned. For the first time, the committee was looking at me, not as the daughter he dismissed, but as the officer standing in front of them with undeniable proof. My father rose again, trying to smother the fire. Evidence can be forged, he argued. Records can be manipulated. But his voice no longer filled the chamber. It cracked at the edges like old armor giving way. That was when the colonel leaned forward, his tone sharp as a blade. If this is what you call incompetence, General, then what does excellence look like? The silence that followed was the kind that breaks men. My father's lips parted, but nothing came out. The question was a trap he couldn't escape, because the truth was already spread across the table in front of him. His authority had been his weapon for years, but authority means nothing when the evidence bleeds through. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to strike. I just stood there, letting his silence condemn him more loudly than any speech could. The committee chair cleared her throat, the final weight dropping. Their ruling came swift, decisive, and sharp enough to cut through decades of his control. My actions had upheld the highest standard of duty. My father's had corroded it. Effective immediately, his rank was stripped, his influence severed. My own status was restored, elevated and tied to a new command. I sat still while the air shifted, every breath in the room acknowledging the reversal. My father finally stood, rigid, pale, his salute stiff and empty before he turned and walked out without once meeting my eyes. The sound of his boots echoed, hollow, fading into the corridor like a legacy unraveling. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. The reversal wasn't in his fall. It was in my rise. For years he had tried to bury me under silence, but silence had become my ground, my weapon, my shield. And now it was my stage. When I walked out of that chamber, the cameras swarmed, questions flying like sparks. I gave them none of my fire. Just a calm walk, steady steps, the weight of the folders light in my hands now that they had done their work. No victory speech, no triumphal cry, just the quiet certainty that I had taken back what was mine. My name, my career, my power. The reversal was complete, not because I shouted louder, but because I stayed sharper. And in the silence that followed, I was no longer just his daughter. I was the woman who had outplanned him, outlasted him, and walked away with everything he thought I could never hold. When I look back on that day, the image that lingers isn't the laughter in the Pentagon or the sting of my father's words. It's the silence that followed when the truth finally surfaced, when the evidence cut through every lie and left nothing standing but fact. I remember the feel of the folders in my hands, the faint scent of jet fuel still clinging to my uniform, and the cold marble floor beneath my boots as I walked out with my head high. That was the moment I realized revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits, quiet and patient, until justice arrives with a precision no one can deny. The lesson I carry, and the one I want you to hold, is simple. Silence isn't weakness. Silence is preparation. It's the space where discipline grows and strategy sharpens. The world may mock you, diminish you, even try to erase you. But if you're willing to bide your time, to keep your proof close, and to strike only when the moment is right, then justice will speak louder than any insult ever could. So I'll ask you this: have you ever been mocked into silence, only to realize later that your silence was the sharpest weapon you had? Tell me in the comments, because your story matters too. And if this story resonated with you, stay with me. Subscribe to Hidden Vengeance, not just to hear stories like mine, but to remind yourself that justice is possible, even when it feels out of reach. Because in a world that thrives on noise, those who master silence will always outlast the rest. Thank you for hearing my story to the very end. Thank you for giving voice to what others dismiss. The truth endures only when someone like you is there to see it.